Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Furnace Stars Podcast 5th season. Be sure to like and subscribe. Enjoy this amazing episode because Ralph Macchio boards the mothership to discuss Transformers and the Spider-Man Clone Saga from Marvel Comics. Now, come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Macchio. Thank you for coming to the Furnace Stars Podcast.
My pleasure. I love doing it.
It's totally my honor, sir. So, I always start off with a question of inspiration. So, inspire your love for comics and who your earliest influences.
I would say that to get into, I had never really intended, strangely enough, to get into comics as a career. I was going for a master's degree in English, and I was hoping to teach. And at the time, this was in the mid '70s, there weren't teaching jobs. It was just a bad situation back then. And I had been to the one convention I went to because I heard Jack Kirby was going to be there. So I brought some Thor issues and I asked him to sign it. And as I was leaving the convention, as I was walking out, somewhere in the lobby, there was a table set up. And for some reason, Don McGregor was there. And I had been a big fan of his Black Panther and his Kill Ravens books. So I heard him mention the Black Panther. So before I walked out, I was right at the door. And if I'd walked out, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. I went over to him. I mentioned my name and I asked him if he'd sign a Black Panther book. And he remembered that I had written quite a few letters to the Black Panther and to Kill Raven. So he asked me to wait on the side while he continued to sign some more books. Then he invited me to come back into the convention with him. He had to pack up a few things and all. And then he asked me if I wanted to come up and have a tour of Marvel. So I said, sure. I was in the city, I just driven in and I live in New Jersey, so it was in the commuting distance. So he took me up to Marvel that very day and I was shown around the office. And while we were up there, Chris Claremont, who had just started with the X-Men and was doing Iron Fist and all, we ran into him in the hall. Don McGregor introduced us. And Chris and I, as I did with Don, we became very, very good friends through the years. And Chris said, hey, I've read a lot of your letters. You sent a lot of letters to my Iron Fist book and to X-Men. He goes, you know what? I'm editing Marvel's fan magazine, which was called FOOM, Friends of Old Marvel. He goes, would you like to interview Roy Thomas? And would you like to write an article on Conan? Now, this is all coming to me, within 2 hours. So I said, okay, there's no reason why not. So he goes, okay, Roy is only coming up once a week on Fridays because he's thinking about moving out to the West Coast. But he's also considering whether to come back as editor-in-chief. He was kind of going back and forth. So I said, fine. So I would come in on Fridays, but Roy was so busy at that point that he would kind of beg me off for next week to do the interview. So I had an excuse to come up to Marvel and hang around the office during the day on Fridays. And I got to know people, and I got to know Archie Goodwin and John Warner and all these other people. And eventually I did get to interview Roy, and I did get to write the article on Conan, and it is in the Foom Fan magazine, which was really my first published work for Marvel. And I wound up being asked by John Warner, who was the assistant editor on Marvel's Black and White magazines at that time, which included Doc Savage, Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, Planet of the Apes, Doc Savage. He asked me if I wanted to come on as his assistant because Archie Goodwin was just promoted as editor. So none of these things I had intended, I had a master plan for, or anything. And then I thought about it and I said, well, I'm still looking to get my master's, but I could do that on weekends, and teaching jobs are just not coming through. So I wound up taking his job that he offered me as his assistant on the Black and White books, and I stayed there for 35 years. That's my origin. So when you said, what was your inspiration and all that, I loved reading the books, and my inspiration was I would write letters copiously to the Marvel books because I was practicing, of course, just writing, period. I had a lot of things to say as I got older about Marvel Comics, and so I would constantly write to all the books. And interestingly enough, Don McGregor remembered that I had written quite a bit to his books, and Chris Claremont, and that's really what opened the door for me to get up there. But that's how it was. Once I started in, I think it was April of 1976, I never left. I stayed on staff for 35 years. I left in 2011, and of course, I left under very friendly terms. So I have remained um, in contact with Marvel. I go up there every once in a while, and I continue to work for them. I do the editorials sometimes in the for the hardcover books, the epic collections, and the masterworks and all. And right now, in fact, just today, I got in from one of our artists, Mike Cho, a 10-page Eternal story that I wrote, that I actually plotted, and I'm going to be scripting it. We're going to be printing out his his pages that he sent. So I stay current with Marvel. Mark Panici was nice enough to ask me. They're doing a 50th anniversary book on the Eternals, and he said, "Ralph, I know your big connection with the Eternals. You kind of started at the same time that Kirby was bringing Eternals to Marvel. So that was 50 years ago. So he said, why don't you do an Eternal story?" So I had one right on tap, and Mike Cho just penciled it. So I'm ready to get to it. So my connection with
Cool.
Marvel is strong.
I mean, you kind of live the dream of every comic book fan. I mean, I sent letters to different comic publishers. A lot of people have. We all dream that someday they'll be like, "Hey, that letter's so special. Let's talk to you." But you've actually lived the dream of that every one of us dreams of. So how does it feel to go from the letter writer and then realize that you're now the person people are sending letters to?
I was very fortunate in doing that. And it's funny because way back when we were starting with the Marvel films, I had been one of the people who'd been invited out to the coast to work with Jon Favreau on the first Iron Man screenplay. Joe Quesada and with several of the other editors, and Mark Millar was working for Marvel at the time. We all were invited out there. And then later on, I continued to have some input into the early films, giving critiques and all that, as a number of us did. And I remember Kevin Feige at one point, he asked me if I wanted to be a background character in the first Thor movie. So anybody who sees the first Thor movie, I'm at the end. I'm at the banquet table at the end of the first Thor movie. I'm right at the end. They dress me up in an Asgardian outfit and all that. And it was wonderful to watch it all being filmed. So we stayed out there. Walt Simonson is also there, and he's at the table, and his wife Louise Simonson is there too. And it was just fascinating to be involved in this process and to meet Tom Hiddleston and Chris Hemsworth and Kenneth Branagh and all these people. And I had gotten a letter from Kevin Feige, an email where he said, "Ralph," he goes, "you went from letter hack to Marvel Comics editor to being in a Marvel movie." He goes, "Not bad for one career." So that kind of added the extra bit to it. So it was wonderful.
That is awesome, and I think it's even more awesome that you were there in the making of the original Iron Man movie, which obviously started the comic book movie boom and kind of like the new golden age of Marvel of comic book films. When you were shown whatever copy you saw of Iron Man, what did you first think about it? Did you know this was going to launch what basically became one of the major mega blockbusters or started the franchise of one of the biggest in history?
Well, it's interesting because really the first Marvel film, and you, you have to give credit. This was to the actor who played Blade, Wesley Snipes, because Wesley really, I understand at one point he wanted to play the Black Panther, but that wasn't available at the time. But he did Blade, and Blade was really the first Marvel film. And then Iron Man followed that a bit later. But the three Blade movies were incredibly successful. When I had gone out there with a number of the other Marvel editors, they had not cast anyone yet. A couple of interesting behind the scenes things. At that time, the studio wanted Tom Cruise to be Tony Stark. And you know what? That made sense. He was a noted guy for blockbusters. He was a guy who brought people, into theaters. He was a superstar. And he could have played Tony Stark. It would have been very different than Robert Downey Jr. But the guy who was pushing for Robert Downey Jr. was Jon Favreau. And Jon Favreau stuck to it and eventually got him in there. And what was interesting about it, too, is that at that time, Robert Downey Jr. was not really known for being an actor so much as being a drug addict at the time. And it was just some bad things. He was found sleeping in somebody's bed somewhere in somebody else's house. So he was not really who Disney thought would be quite good for the part. Jon Favreau fought for him. Robert Downey came in and, as we all know, did a fabulous job. And for my part in it, because I'm a huge Gwyneth Paltrow fan, I kept pushing. Every time we would sit down and we would go through the script with him, I would tell him, John, there's only one actress that could play Pepper Potts, and that's Gwyneth Paltrow. And he got tired of hearing it from me. Now, I don't know if that worked in his brain and he just went for it, or if he was thinking about Gwyneth all along. But I'd like to think that I played a little part in getting her the part of Pepper Potts.
So what was it about Gwyneth Paltrow that you felt fit Pepper Potts best?
Well, I just thought she's such a versatile actress. I have always loved her. I've seen her in everything from Great Expectations right up to the movie that's going to be opening of hers on Christmas Day called Marty Supreme, which is about a ping pong player. So I'll be seeing it, but I'm not sure, if it's got commercial legs or not. I hope it does. But she did Shakespeare in Love, and she got the Academy Award for. And she just had a look of that tall, slender look, and they could dye her hair red as they did. She's normally blonde. But I just loved her as an actress, and I just was infatuated with her as a beauty. She just had a warm quality about her, absolutely beautiful woman. And I said, boy, if I could push to get her to be Pepper Potts, that would really be something. So I did push for it. And by the way, I also had the opportunity to tell her that. Because somewhat later, when I was up at Marvel, the studio guys knew that I loved Gwyneth. So what they did was they called me at the Marvel offices. And this, I guess, was a couple of years later or something. And they said, hey, Ralph, your girl Gwyneth, she's now at Barnes & Noble on Fifth Avenue, and she's signing the cookbook that she did called My Father's Daughter. It was a huge cookbook that she did. So I said, she's down there now? I said, yeah. So they called me from the studio to let me know. So I ran out of the office and I told my assistant, we had a big editorial meeting. And I said, I don't care if they're going to fire me. I'm going down to meet her. So we were, in that area. So I was able to walk down there. I got into the into the Barnes & Noble bookstore. Interestingly enough, there was no mention of her outside. I thought they would have said something like, Gwyneth Paltrow was here signing. Nothing. When I went inside, I was told that she was upstairs. So I went up the escalator. There was a big guy up there. And I said, I'm here. I'd like to get online to meet Gwyneth Paltrow. He goes, not unless you buy a cookbook. So I went down the escalator and there were only two left. And I had to wait online because this was the line for people buying books. And I said, I hope somebody doesn't buy those last two. Luckily, I got the second to the last one. I went back upstairs, got online. I thought I'll be online with a whole bunch of women now. They were all men. And
of course.
I had two or three of these cookbooks, so I was not the only Gwyneth maniac. Eventually, I got up to meet her, and I told her, I said, Miss Paltrow, I wanted you to know that I work for Marvel Entertainment and that I constantly whispered in Jon Favreau's ear that you would be perfect to play that part. She looked at me and said, isn't that sweet? And she signed the cookbook and she put a little heart in there. And then I kind of took the cookbook and I floated back to my office.
That's awesome.
So I did have a chance to meet her, to be in her presence, and to tell her that I had done it. So that's enough for one lifetime.
It seems like the theme with you is that you accomplish every dream that every person who was in a position to love comics or films wishes they could fall into the way you were able to make your way that way.
Jeff, I agree with you on that, and I'll tell you, it becomes difficult for me when I go to conventions. And the last year or two, I've gone to a lot of conventions. Tom DeFalco pushed me into going. He said, "Ralph, you could be a guest at these things. People would like to see you and all that." I said, "All right, Tom." So I got an agent and I went, and it was wonderful. But people would come up to me who want to get into the business, and they'd say, "Can you tell me how you got into Marvel?" And I would tell them, and I'm saying, I don't think you can repeat this unless you happen to run into somebody that's going to take you for a tour up to Marvel and then give you a writing assignment. My origin story is kind of unique. So, yes, it was living a dream, but at the same time, it's not anything that could be repeated. And as I said before, Jeff, I did not intend to work at Marvel because I didn't know anything about what you would do at Marvel. I had an academic career. I had a background in English Lit, and I was going for my master's. And I didn't think that, oh, I could get a job up at Marvel because I didn't know what you would do up there. I mean, I read about the Marvel bullpen as every kid did, and stay in soapbox, and it sounded like a lot of fun, but I wouldn't know what I would do up there. So it wasn't until I actually got up there and I saw the way the editorial assignments were done and the people working the bullpen
Mm.
that I said, oh, okay, I could probably, get a job up here as an assistant editor and just stay. And another point I'll make too is at that time, most people who were on staff, and I had a chance to meet a lot of the people who later became, really top writers at Marvel, Steve Englehart, Steve Gerber, Jerry Conway, Marv Wolfman, Len Week, they really were only on staff long enough until they could get enough books to go off and write.
Mm.
Now, you see, the reason that I stayed so many years on staff was because I didn't like the solitary life of a writer. I thought, I don't like the idea of having to be off on my own and just sitting there and writing full time. Now, I've written quite a bit for Marvel, and again, I've got this 10-pager I'll be writing soon, but I didn't want to do that full time. I like the idea of going into an office every day. I like the idea of interacting with people, and I like the idea of having my fingers in many different aspects of the comic, whereas the writer just writes.
Mm.
He doesn't have anything to do with the art, really. You know who the art is, and the artist is, the lettering, the coloring, the cover. But I like that. And I like the office atmosphere. And I love being up at Marvel. I made a lot of friends up there. So contrary to what most people did who were on staff at that time, I decided to stay. And that's
Mm.
why I was there for so many years.
Well, one thing that's kind of interesting is that, and maybe it's coincidental or not coincidental, but when the movies, comic book movies have reached their golden boom, right? At
Mm-hmm.
the same time, comic books have now become, in the world of academics, have gotten a boom in credibility in the world of, in the college world, right? In university. And as someone who was an English lit major at a time when I imagine comic books weren't taking the same level of seriousness, did you view comic books the same way as you viewed your English lit from your degree? Did you analyze them the same way, think about them the same way as you would those stories?
Actually, yes, I did, because Stan Lee, who during the 60s helped make Marvel relevant to the college crowd. And Stan became a major celebrity on college campuses. I still have the Esquire magazine from 1966 or 67, in which they talked about Stan being on all the college campuses, and they had quotes from a lot of college students who loved Doctor Strange and got into all of that other stuff at Marvel. And yes, I did take it seriously because Stan pointed out that the comic book format, the idea of telling a story in sequential panels, you could tell any kind of story that way. And he
Mm.
attempted, both with the art and with the writing, to elevate comic book storytelling. The way he wrote, he didn't write down to the readers. A lot of times I went to a dictionary and looked up a word that Stan had in there, as I think we all did. And also when he wrote Thor, he was doing pseudo Shakespearean stuff. And me, as an English major, having read Shakespeare plays and loved them, I said, this is fantastic. Somebody pointed out to me at one point, and I had the answer for them. They said, well, you've got Thor, who's a Norwegian god, and all these Asgardians, and they're speaking in sort of this English thing, from back then, Elizabethan English. And I said, well, if you read Hamlet, Hamlet's from Denmark, and he was speaking in Elizabethan English. So it's okay to do it.
Well, I mean, that brings up the idea that, I mean, you did write The Mighty Thor for a while with Mark Gruenwald,
Yes, I
and
did.
including Thor's 300 issue, you're dealing with things like the Celestials, you got Odin. These are large scale comic books, but at the same
Yeah,
time, they're borrowed from, as we all know, Norse mythology, which is also very deep into English literature.
exactly.
With that background, was that one of the reasons why you ended up working in The Mighty Thor as one of the writers?
Well, originally, I always loved Thor. He's probably my favorite. I wouldn't say my favorite character. I probably would say that Daredevil is. But my favorite world to be involved in series was Thor because it just incorporated so many things. The science fiction aspect, the Norse mythology. I got interested in Norse mythology from reading Tales of Asgard. But uh, at the time, I had worked with Roy earlier on when I came on staff. I became his East Coast liaison on Conan. And eventually, when he took over Thor, he knew that I had an interest in it, and he asked Mark Ruwald and I if we wanted to come on and kind of work with him on Thor. Throw some ideas at him. Occasionally, rewrote an issue every once in a while, and just serve as sort of a backboard to him, as a sounding board for things he wanted to do in the book. And then eventually, he was doing the Ring of the Nibelung up in, at the time that he was leaving, the last 6 or 7 issues, he was really telling the Ring of the Nibelung story. And then he left with 299, and when 300 came up, Mark, he had left some notes for us, and Mark and I picked up on it, and we realized that we had to end in that issue the Celestial story, this huge Celestial story that was going on. Plus, we had to end the Ring of the Nibelung story. So I remember talking to Mark, and I said, Mark, this is so big that if we do just the allotted pages that we have, we're not going to be able to make this thing have the kind of expansive look that it deserves. So I called up Keith Pollard, and I said, let's not tell our editor, who I think was Jim Salicrup at the time. And I said, let's just have Keith keep adding pages, not tell the editor, and just hope nobody notices, even though they'd have to drop ads and all that. And that's what we did. And the reason that 300 was such a landmark issue, which I'm very, very proud of, and I know Mark, if he was here, would be proud of it too, is because we thought at one point, when Jack Kirby started with the Eternals in 1976, he set up this enormous thing where Arishem, the great Celestial, he was in the Andes Mountains with his thumb up like this, and in 50 years, he was going to decide whether mankind was worthy of surviving, or he was going to turn thumbs down and the Earth would have been obliterated. So Mark and I were going, it doesn't matter what happens in any other book, because no matter how many times Spider-Man takes down the Green Goblin or Doc Ock, or Iron Man takes down the Mandarin or whatever, beyond all this is this enormous threat to the planet that is there in the Andes Mountains. So we determined, Kirby, was long gone from Marvel at that point. We determined that we were going to set it up so that Arishem at that point would give his judgment, and he would, one way or the other, give it positive or negative, and leave. And what we did was we wanted to set up a huge battle between the Celestials and the Destroyer. We put Odin in the Destroyer armor, and then eventually we had all the young gods that Jerry Conway had created, which were supposed to be the best aspects of mankind, and we brought them in to show Arishem what mankind could be. And he gave his decision, and then he left. It popped into my head at one point. I take credit for this. I passed this on to Roy. I said, when I was looking at the Destroyer, I remember the very first 2 issues that the Destroyer was in Thor, and I just loved that story because he was a character that actually break Thor's hammer. His beam came out of his eye and the hammer was broken up. When I was a kid reading that, I went, I can't believe this. So I thought at that point, I said, Odin had left him on Earth to deal with the final threat to the planet Earth. But that had never been, figured out. That was just, they thought it was left here, but what that final threat was never discussed. We just kept bringing the Destroyer back again and again. So I mentioned to Roy, I said, look, what if the final threat were the Celestials? So Roy liked that idea. And that's how in issue 300, Mark and I had Odin get into the Destroyer's armor, grow to gigantic size, take the Odin sword, and go up against the Celestials. And even though he lost and was reduced to slag, but eventually Walt brought him back, which was a great idea, it still was something very, very important. And I'm glad that we did that. And I'm glad that 300 did what we set out to do. We wanted to end a huge storyline that had been kind of overhanging the Marvel Universe since Kirby had started with the Eternals in 76. And it worked out. We did get those extra pages. And anybody, looking at that issue will see we've got the double spreads and the full page shots and all the things we needed to make that a satisfactorily, strong, powerful story.
Well, I've always enjoyed reading Thor, and but I also do realize I'm a little different than some of the audience because I do love massive scope. I love things in space and other planets and that nature. But for a lot of readers, they need something they can identify with. And Thor, the problem with Thor for being able to identify him is that you're talking about beings from other planets, scales that are massive above us. How do you, and also the speech, which is like old Elizabethan speech. How do you balance that and make sure that for a lot of readers he can still be identified with?
Well, you did have, for a long period of time, you did have the alternate Don Blake identity. And what you mentioned, you pose a very interesting problem. And within the last couple of years, when the last Thor movie came out, Marvel came to me and asked me to write a one-shot Thor story, which would be an evergreen story. So I went back to the time when Don Blake was the alternate identity of Thor. We all remember that Odin had placed Thor's spirit inside of Don Blake so he could learn humility. And what I did in that story was to humanize the whole thing was I wanted to show that the healer was as important as the warrior.
Mm.
And so what I did was I set up a troll war because I love those issues that introduced Ulick and had the troll war, and I just love that stuff. And I sent all that material to the artist from those Kirby issues, and I said, let's try to do something as expansive and as incredible as that. So what I did was once we got to Asgard, Thor comes in, and Odin is gone at this point. Loki is actually now in charge of Asgard. He's trying to be a great general and ruler, but he's not. He doesn't understand what it takes to be a leader. But when Thor comes in, he rallies the troops. What happens is Sif gets a almost fatal blow. Something hits her, and when she's taken into a tent during the war, they can't save her. Thor comes in and he realizes that all his powers as a warrior are not going to save Sif. No one can do that. But what could save her was Don Blake. So he transforms to Don Blake, and he does what no one else could have done. No warrior, no general, not even Odin could do. He saves her life as Don Blake. And so that was my way of showing that the human half of Thor, that healer, is just as important as the warrior. Now, perhaps Odin could have saved her, but he wasn't there at the time. And so I wanted to set it up that way, that even the Asgardian doctors were helpless before what she had. So I'm trying to answer your point there about the humanity of it. It is very important that he be human. And yes, I do realize that there was a certain distance between Thor and the reader in the ways that he wouldn't identify with him the way you would, for example, with Peter Parker and Matt Murdock, because the way he talked and he was a god and all. But I really liked the Thor, Don Blake dichotomy there. I thought that worked out very, very well. I wish, they could bring that back. I know I've emailed a few times with Al Ewing, who's doing an absolutely fabulous job on Thor. I mean, I send him complimentary emails all the time about how great his work is on that Thor. It's fabulous. But I really wish when they bring Don Blake back this time, they could sort of go back to that whole thing. But that may be just the kid in me, wanting to return to when I was a kid.
Well, I mean, going back to the idea of just humanity, one thing, like I said, you had this great career as a scriptwriter. You became an editor. As an editor, the hardest thing to do is probably working with people. Because as you know, as a writer, and I do some writing of my own, it's very easy to be sensitive to your own work. It's very the line between criticism and constructive criticism can be very narrow, a very thin line. How did the script writing help you when you became an editor, knowing how to talk to people who are trying to get this work done?
Well, when I first became an editor, I really hadn't written very much, so it didn't really play until later. But I had a way of working with people. One of the other reasons that I stayed on staff was I like to work with people. And my ideas about being an editor evolved over time. And I began to realize that creative people really need encouragement. As creative as anybody could be. And this goes from Kirby and Stan all the way down, to the guy just starting writing. Creative people have a lot of insecurities about what they've done. And if you want them to perform like giants, you encourage them. Yes, you do give constructive criticism, but you always give it in a positive way. If you have to go after a writer or an artist and you have to yell at them on the phone or you have to tell them that their ideas stink or all that, then they shouldn't be on the book. Either they shouldn't be on the book or you shouldn't be on the book.
Right.
You should be working to get their vision across and to help them. It's not your vision that's important, really. It's their vision. But the editor is also the one who has the final word, and to make sure that continuity and characterization are followed. For example, you may have a writer who wants to come on, and he wants to have Matt Murdock kill somebody or Peter Parker kill somebody because he may want to go up online, and talk to all of his fans and say, see, I'm the one guy that had so-and-so, killed somebody. Well, that's where the editor has to come in and say, no, that's where you have to draw the line. The editor needs to know where to draw the line because you are a representative of the company. The writer is a freelancer. He's going to go from job to job. But you're a representative of the company. And you have to make sure that what they're doing is within line of the characterization as established and that the continuity is followed. Beyond that, you want the writer's vision to be put on paper. And likewise with the artists. I was always calling artists up and telling them, you did such fabulous work. I mean, I wish I was writing this, I would work with them. And also you have to juggle all the creative people to make sure that they're meshing. You want to make sure that the writer is meshing with the artist and that the inking is working for the penciler and all of this stuff. So yes, later on, as I was a writer, that also played into me as an editor because I could see what a writer was going for, and I remember having written something myself, and I could refer to that when I was talking to a particular writer. I said, yeah, I encounter that same problem that you have that you have now, and this is how I solved it. But initially, I was just kind of formulating my ideas, and I just thought it's very good to encourage people. That's how you get the best out of them. That's how you make them perform. And I got that really. One time I was talking to George Russo. So George was our colorist, our staff colorist. But George had a history in comics that went all the way back to the beginning. He used to ink Batman back in the 40s. And I talked to George at one point, and he, was just a font of wisdom about comics and creators in comics. He knew Bob Kane, he knew Finger, all those guys. Bill Finger. And so I talked with him at one point, and he said to me, he goes, Ralph, when you're working with creative people, he goes, if you want them to perform just to get it done, he goes, be critical of them, not them. Just tell them the work is just satisfactory, and they'll just work that way. But if you want them to perform like giants, if you want them to perform like they're 10 feet tall, make them feel like they're 10 feet tall. Encourage them. Tell them what they did was good, but it could be even better if they did this and this. And George was absolutely right.
Now, having been, like I said, doing all your script writing, who was the editor who did that for you?
It's interesting. I'm trying to remember who the first editor that I worked for. You know what? It would be Roger Stern. Because under Roger Stern, and Roger had been at Marvel longer than I was, and Roger was a great teacher for me. He showed me things when I was on staff about how to work and do the letter columns, because at that time we had to cut and paste, and I learned how to do that with letter columns. I learned how to answer letters, always with a positive spin. Roger pointed that out to me, and I said, that's right, because you even want to treat the readers who are sending letters. You don't want to discourage them, or you don't want to mock them for a while. You should have realized that. No, you want them to say, hey, thank you for writing in. Be nice to them. That's your bread and butter, are the readers. I worked with him on the Project Pegasus stories, because he came to me at one point and he said, Ralph, he goes, I'm kind of running out of Marvel 2-in-1 stories because they didn't have a steady writer on it. He goes, think of a couple of stories to write over the weekend. And I said, oh, I'd love to, Roger. So I came back and I sort of conceived of the whole Project Pegasus story, which you probably remember. It was initially in 2-in-1. It was 2 issues. And then later on, Mark Grunwald, who was my buddy at the time, said, Ralph, I really like this project story. He goes, I got an idea for a 6-part storyline. And okay, but that's another story. What happened was when I turned in the plot, Roger was very encouraging to me. And the suggestions that he gave me, and the criticism that he gave me, the critiques, were always given to me in a very positive note. I didn't go away with my head down like, oh boy, I shouldn't have even written this. He encouraged me, and he even told me that he liked what I had done in the first issue so much that he was going to get John Byrne to draw the second issue. So I was thrilled. And it was at that point really that I began to realize that as a writer, the fact that I got such encouragement from the editor emboldened me. It made me really want to go back and write and do something. But if he had come to me with criticisms that were like, just rip me apart, I would have walked away and I probably would have said, I don't even know why I want to do this, you know?
Mm. Criticism
Criticism is absolutely important and it's vital. So that's how you learn your craft. But it's the way that criticism is delivered that's the key point. And so from Roger Stern, I got the idea of doing things in a very positive light, and I took that with me.
Now, one of the more, as you mentioned a little bit off air, one of your most famous miniseries was the Transformers miniseries that launched the whole Transformers ongoing through Marvel, though it originally was supposed to be a 4-issue miniseries.
Yeah.
At the same time, they were making the Transformers cartoon. How much dialogue was there between you writing the comic book and the writers who were doing the cartoon?
I did not have any real connection with them. I had been given Bob Budiansky, I believe, he was the editor on it. And he asked me to write the first issue, which I thought was very interesting. I was kind of known at the time as a guy who would. I was sort of at one point I was kind of like the toy office. I had Micronauts, I had ROM, I had US1, I had a whole bunch of the He-Man and all, and Crystar, which was something that I created with Mark Rumo. They were all sort of toys. So Bob came to me and he asked if I wanted to write the first issue. And I was given kind of a handbook or whatever. I never had any direct contact with the writers of the cartoon show or anything, but I did see sort of this handbook of what the characters' powers were and things like that. And I remember Bob and I sitting down discussing it. And there's a sequence of pages in there that I completely rewrote because I was kind of thinking about how to add more to their personalities and things like that. And it was very copy heavy, but they wanted the characters introduced very, very comprehensively. So the first time we saw Bumblebee or Optimus Prime, it was important to get all of that biographical material in there about them. So it wasn't easy to do, but I was able to do that. So it was Bob who had that kind of contact with the people who wrote it. Now, later on, Bob asked me, or I don't remember if I wrote the first issue first or if I wrote the movie adaptation. On one or the other, I've gotten confused on which was which. But the movie adaptation was broken down into 3 issues. And I had been asked to do that because I, again, was kind of the guy, I was the go-to guy for movie adaptation. I had written Darkman, I did Independence Day, I did Meteor, I also did House 2. So when Marvel was going to do movie adaptations, I loved doing them. I just liked the idea of doing this transposition from a movie script to a comic book page. I also did Dune, which Bob Budiansky edited too, and my buddy Bill Sienkiewicz drew, and another one I'm very, very proud of. So when they were doing the Transformers movie, they naturally came to me because I was the guy. And it wasn't as if I was incredibly invested in the Transformers because I hadn't written much. Again, I think I wrote the first issue, and then I think the movie adaptation came later. But again, it could have been reversed. But it was just that I was the guy who did a lot of movie adaptations, so I was asked to do it, and I think it came out, very nicely. And as I've mentioned to you earlier, I had just recently been invited to a Transformers convention, which Bob Budiansky attended, and I kind of leaned on Bob because I'd never been to one of these before. But they told me that I was invited because really that first issue helped set up a lot of the things that came later in terms of personalities and powers and setting up the 2 worlds and all that, the Decepticons, the Autobots. And I thought, okay, that was great. And I met an awful lot of very nice people there, just like comic book fans. They couldn't be nicer people. I had a million Transformers comics to sign. And I'll tell you something else. When I attend a comic book convention, I get as many Transformers comics to sign as I get anything else that I've done through the years. So there really is a Transformers subculture out there, and
Yes.
they're really very, very nice people.
And the thing with Transformers, like I said, I grew up on Transformers. I grew up I'm a kid of the 80s. I'm 45, so I grew up with Transformers and I love Transformers. On paper, the idea can sound absurd. Big talking robots from another planet crash land on our planet 4 million years ago and suddenly come back to life and start this major war. On paper, it sounds absurd on some level. Obviously, in practice, it's fantastic. It's a great franchise. When you
Sure.
first heard about what it was, when someone first tried to explain it to you, did you immediately think this is fantastic, or did you think, well, this sounds kind of weird? Where were you mentally when you first heard the concept?
Well, Jeff, like you, I'm steeped in comic books. So, you
Yes.
know, with that kind of background, I mean, again, I edited the Micronauts. I forgot to mention, I also edited ROM. So, there you had the dire rates, against the ROM, I forgot what it is, the Galadorians. So to me, that was no different.
Hmm.
I never looked at anything. We were used to the most fantastic things in the world. I mean, we had a Norse god that came down to Earth and was involved with the high evolutionary and living planets and all this stuff. So Transformers was nothing new. Like I went, oh, this is too weird to work on. Not at all.
The other thing with writing Transformers, interestingly enough, when you approach it as a writer, did you view it as a team up book or a sci-fi book? Because the cast is massive, especially of the Autobots.
Yes. Well, they were incorporated into Marvel Earth because there
Hmm.
were characters later on that did interact. So did take place on Marvel Earth. But I did view it more as a science fiction concept. Definitely, yes.
Now, in issue 3, you do bring in Spider-Man. Now, was that a decision because you just love Spider-Man? Was that editorial? Let's make sure the reader of Spider-Man jump into Transformers. Can you dive into the use of Spider-Man for issue 3?
No, I think, and I'm just supposing here, was that you certainly weren't going to hurt sales by guest starring Spider-Man, and you also were going you also were going to show that this Autobots and Decepticon war occurred within the Marvel universe. So that was an important thing. So guest starring him then was had a dual purpose.
Were there thoughts within that miniseries of putting them even deeper into the Marvel universe and making their war part of the Marvel universe storyline, or was it basically keep them isolated within the Marvel universe, though mention kind of that they are part of it?
I think it was the latter. I don't think we wanted because there were so many characters. You don't want to get too into it and involve them too much with Marvel Earth and the Marvel universe. But you did want to indicate that yes, it occurred here, just as Rom did and Micronauts did. They were all part and parcel of the Marvel universe. They occurred on Marvel Earth 616. But you don't want to get so involved in it that every issue your guest star. You have a million characters anyway, so every issue now you got a guest star so and so, or people then start to ask questions like, well, if one of the Decepticons is going after New York City, how come the Avengers didn't get it? Well, that starts to open a can of worms. Don't get involved in.
Well, I was gonna say, well, Transformers would be one of the few comic books in Marvel that didn't take place in New York uh, for a lot of it. One other interesting about Transformers, there's always been a debate, I think, in the realm of Transformers, which is those who want to focus solely on the Transformers, and those who like the human element brought into Transformers. And in your story, you brought in Buster Witwicky. Was he supposed to be the audience viewing, the eyes of the audience? Was it a feeling of how the audience would connect with Transformers without a human experience? Like, can you kind of connect where Buster Witwicky fit into your larger idea?
Well, I think you always need the human element, and he was kind of the eyes of the audience there. I mean, you have these gigantic robotic figures clashing. You need a human element in there, and I think that was that's what his purpose was in that book. Definitely, yes.
When obviously in the TV show it's Spike Witwicky, in the your book is Buster. Are they basically the same character from a conceptual standpoint? Was there any kind of like decision of how that branched off?
Honestly, I don't know. That would be those kind of things would be something that would be more properly, you know, mentioned to Bob Budiansky because he was really involved. That was kind of above my pay grade. As the
Hmm.
writer, you know, I would follow up on things they wanted me to do, but where you know the reason for a character being introduced and things like that, that was kind of done above my head. Although I can say with the character you mentioned prior to that, that it was definitely to give a human element to the war and to the characters.
I think another thing, for looking at your career from your point of view of being an editor, which obviously for a while you were also the editor of Marvel Comics, including Daredevil, and one of
Yes.
the books you were editor on was the Born Again Frank Miller storyline, which is another famous Daredevil storyline. So, a couple of things. I mean, obviously, people Frank Miller is one of the legends. What was he like to work with as his editor, and also what input or connections did you have to the Born Again storyline that helped it become what it was?
Okay. Now I go really all the way back almost to the beginning with Frank. I remember the first time he came up to Moreland, we had his portfolio, and you know he was a kid from Vermont at the time. People think that because he writes so powerfully that kind of inner urban story that he must be a New York guy, but he wasn't. He was from Vermont. And I remember getting very friendly with Frank. And when I was Denny O'Neill's assistant, because Denny was editing Daredevil, Frank at that point was on as a artist. And I believe it was when Denny was editing the book that Roger McKenzie left and Frank came on as the writer. Now, it was a bold move to make Frank the writer because he never had experience as a writer before, really. I mean, it's hard to believe that now, but back then, he was the guy who drew Daredevil. And I believe it was under Denny that he became the writer as well as the artist, and we know where the book went. Not that Roger McKenzie didn't do a fine job on it; he did do a fine job on it, but Frank took it to kind of undreamed of heights. And I think I always got along very well with Frank. He was a heck of a nice guy, still is a heck of a nice guy. And what happened was Denny eventually took over as the writer, and I became the editor on Daredevil. And at that time, there were some kind of problems on staff, and I was put in a position where I really was kind of being forced to take Denny off Daredevil.
Mm.
I really didn't want to. I thought he was doing a fine job, but there were political considerations and things at that time, which I don't want to go into, that kind of forced my hand. And so after Denny left, and I believe his last issue that he did was a great story that he did with David Mazzucchelli that had the Vulture in it. It was wonderful stuff. Um, I needed a new guy to come on Daredevil. So right out of the blue, I said, you know what, I'm going to go right to the top. So I called Frank up on the phone, and I just said, Frank, I know you've got more Daredevil stories to do. I said, why don't we do something, some big time story that would be the next step for you with Daredevil. We could break them down, whatever you want to do. Frank said, Ralph, give me a little time to think about it. So about 10 minutes later, he called me back, and he had the Born Again story. He told me what he wanted to do. And the question he had was, he wondered if David Mazzucchelli would have a problem with working with him the way he used to work. And I said, no, I think Dave would be, honored to be working with you, Frank. Mm. So they worked together. And as you know, they not only became such a great team that they went on after that to do Batman Year One.
Mm.
I enjoyed putting Frank with different guys just to see how things would work out. I put him with John Romita Jr. on Man Without Fear. And we know that originally, by the way, was a screenplay that Frank was thinking of selling to Hollywood. And then he brought it to us. And he thought this would make a great thing because it had really the expanded origin of Daredevil. It introduced Elektra and Stick and really integrated them, in a big way into Matt Murdock's early life. And so he and John worked out fabulously on that. And also teaming him up with Bill Sienkiewicz, because I worked with Bill on Moon Knight, of course. And Bill was, had just developed into an incredible avant-garde type, artist. And what happened was they went off and they did this Kingpin story, which we were going to use as like a 2-issue fill-in at the time. And then Jim Shooter saw it and he says, "Oh, we're not going to use this as a fill-in." He goes, so they did it as a separate storyline. You remember the Kingpin was like enormous in that thing. He spread out over the whole thing. But that originally was supposed to be a couple of issue fill-in. But Jim, and I think rightly so, said this is a very special thing. Let's go from there. There was also a story that Frank has only done the one part of, and I think it's called The Devil's Own. It was meant to be a 2-part Daredevil story, but he never wrote the second part. Although maybe today they could get him to do it, because I know he's back doing some stuff at Marvel.
Yeah.
I do have that first issue. I do have the original script on that first issue, and it's a very creepy, very powerful story. And I think if they could get Frank to write part 2, knock it out of the park. Yes. So the first part is written, but the second part has never been done. So I love working with Frank. We got along famously. He's a terrific guy, and I wished him all the success in the world when he went out to Hollywood and showed what he could do. And of course, we know he did The Dark Knight Returns, and I feel that we really kind of started something with Born Again, because from Born Again, that begat Man Without that begat the Batman Year One, Dark Knight, and then Man Without Fear. So I think it started really with Born Again.
So the story, the incomplete story, are you able to at least hint what it was about?
I'm not sure. I really don't have enough. It was many years ago, and I don't really know enough about what Frank had intended to give any sort of like a statement about where he was going with the second issue. I also don't want to constrain him if he does decide to come back and do the second part. But yes, The Devil's Own is there. The script exists for the first part, and the second part I hope someday he'll get to, and they'll run it. It will be something very special.
And so when you have a writer like Frank Miller, who is obviously one of the greats in the world of comic books, and you're the editor, how hands-on do you want to be with someone like that? I mean, and when someone is that skilled, do you just give them free reign to do what they want? Do you kind of be like, do you guide them a little bit more in one way or another? What is your interaction with those who really are stars within the industry?
Well, I with any of the really top people that I've worked with, whether Walt Simonson or Frank Miller, or anybody at that level, people may think, well, these guys just won't be edited. That's not true. They requested input because they knew the benefit of an editor as a sounding board. So I never just blindly accepted something from anybody and just said, okay, you're Frank Miller, we're just going to run it this way. I can tell you about one little sticking point, in fact, in Man Without Fear, that I went back to Frank with, and there was a little story behind it. The idea of Matt Murdock killing someone was something I didn't really like, although, Frank had a different view of Murdoch, that, there was a certain violence inside him that he always said he could have become the supervillain, except for the grace of God. He could have become a supervillain. But there's a scene in there where young Matt Murdock is protecting a woman, and there's a guy, a gangster, firing bullets, and Matt is deflecting. He's not in his costume, because this is long before that. He's still a college student. And he's deflecting the bullets. And then he goes, "Don't make me kill you." But the guy is continuing to fire. So Matt deflects the bullet, and it goes into the guy's forehead, and it kills him. So I thought about that, and I actually got back to Frank, and I said, "Frank, I understand the guy was trying to kill him, so I guess he's justified in it." I said, "But could you write a couple of captions just indicating that Matt doesn't really have a choice or whatever?" Frank didn't like that. He thought, well, that's kind of clunky and whatever. But he went with my request on that. What happened, which was funny, was after he wrote it, I brought those captions out to the bullpen because they were going to paste them into the pages. That's how we did things back then.
Yeah.
And the guys in the bullpen, who were huge Miller fans and Daredevil fans, they looked at this and they go, "Oh, no. This just looks like you added this in at the last minute and all." And I said, "You know what, guys, you're a good sounding board." So I went back to Frank and I said, "Forget it." And he told me, "Because Ralph, I'm still laughing." So we had a little he was willing to do it, but in the end, the guys in the bullpen made good sense, and they were a good sounding board because these guys were big fans. And when they felt that it was kind of clunky and just added on at the last minute, that was it. We never went with it. So I accepted it. But I was there with Frank as he developed as a writer. So I didn't just know him as superstar Frank. I knew him early on when he was the guy who was just, working on Daredevil as the artist and then later as the artist writer. And again, working with Walt Simonson too. Walt, always was, well, do you think this works or whatever? There was always that thing there because people at that level do recognize that an editor does have has a role to play in the book. Likewise, when I worked with Tom DeFalco, and I worked with Tom on Fantastic Four and Thor. Tom was editor-in-chief at the time, and people had asked me, boy, can you edit the editor-in-chief? And I said, Tom, when he worked for me, he was the writer. There was never a thought in my mind that Tom was going to take revenge on me as the editor-in-chief because I edited his script or whatever. Tom respected what I brought to the table as the editor, and we got along very well as writer and editor. And in fact, we also did a Wolverine graphic novel that I edited and Tom wrote and John Buscema drew called Bloody Choices. So Tom and I got along very well. And Tom was that kind of editor-in-chief that you knew he was the boss and you respected what he brought to the table as editor-in-chief. But when he was working for me as the writer on Thor and Fantastic Four, I never once had a thought in my mind that, boy, if I touch his script, he could come after me later. Never. So I did some editing on his work, and I would always call Tom up and say, Tom, I think we could do this scene a little better and all. And the same thing with the superstars. When they were working for me, I was the editor, and they were the creative force. But I always respected what they brought to the table too.
Now, another famous storyline that you were editor of is the Spider-Man Clone Saga storyline, which was big. So, kind of, what part were you there for the whole Clone Saga, or were you there towards? Because I know they mentioned when I was doing some more research on, it, I was buying all the Spider-Man comics at the time as well. I know you included the Norman Osborn part that brought him in the end, and you did kill your decision to kill Ben Riley, which was a great character. But were you there at the beginning of the storyline, or did you come in towards later in the Clone Saga? Because that went on for what, 3 years, almost 2 years?
Yeah, here's what happened. I believe at that time Bob Budiansky was the editor on Spider-Man, and when we say Spider-Man, we're talking about 4 or 5 books,
right?
Not Spider-Man. But the advertising people kept seeing the Clone Saga as something that they wanted to continue. And it just kept going on and on and on. And it really, Bob was in a very, very difficult position at that time. I wouldn't have wanted to be in that position because it's just very difficult to bring this thing to a conclusion because it was just selling so well and it was just, taking off and they wanted it to go on. But a storyline needs to come to an end. So what happened was Bob had left the Spider-Man books. When Bob Harris took over as editor-in-chief, he brought me in. Now, this was midway through the Clone Saga. And Bob and I had a big meeting about it because obviously Spider-Man is our flagship book. And we had to do something. We had to bring this to a conclusion. And I had 4 writers that I was dealing with at the time. And Bob brought me in and he says, Ralph, you're going to be the Spider-Man editor. And believe it or not, Jeff, I did not want to edit Spider-Man. I really liked editing kind of the secondary characters and not necessarily the very top tier because the spotlight is always on you. Or well, what are you going to do now? What's coming next and all that. But if you're working on Moon Knight, you're kind of under the radar. So I always kind of like to work on the secondary characters. And I enjoyed even working on the toy characters too because that was fun. But anyway, Bob said, as we were sitting there talking, and Bob's a very knowledgeable guy about all of it, and I picked him, Bob was my first assistant, by the way. We sat there, we had a great relationship, and he says, Ralph, he goes, I'm thinking about who could be behind the whole Clone Saga, because they didn't have a master villain behind it at that point. And we looked at all the, Miles Warren, the Jackal, not big enough, Harry Osborn, not big enough. And then we both hit on the idea, Norman. But Norman had been gone. He'd been dead for 20 years. He said, what a shock if we could bring Norman back and have him the villain behind the whole thing. But of course, we had to work out a whole backstory for him, how he didn't die and all that other stuff. And then Bob also said, Ralph, he goes, a couple of other things. Now we decided on Norman. Okay, you got your marching orders. He goes, I also want to get rid of the baby. He goes, find a way because we do not want Peter Parker and Mary Jane to have a child. All right, that ages them too much. I said, got it. And then there was the other thing of we wanted to make sure that it wasn't Ben Reilly. Because if you remember, the whole Clone Saga circulated around the idea that was Ben Reilly really Spider-Man? Or was it Peter Parker? Was the guy that we've been reading about for the last number of years really Spider-Man? Or was it the guy who, fell into that smokestack in the Jerry Conway story? Or Archie Goodwin, I forget who had written that. And the reasoning behind it, which was sound, was that Peter Parker had been married. He was now, in a position where he was much older. So if it hadn't really been him this time that we were reading him, but actually Ben Reilly was the real Spider-Man, the real, character, okay, then we, get rid of the other one. But Bob said, no, I want Peter Parker we've been reading about to be that guy. But they had already done some DNA testing or something like that, so we had to reverse all that. So I went back to my writers, and I said, look, guys, this is what we got to do. And I had Howard Macchio on the book at the time. Tom DeFalco was there, Mark DeMattis, and other people as well were working on it too. And I said, these are our marching orders. Now, when we brought Norman back, it was quite a shock. And I said, I know we're going to get Todd DeZago was my other guy. Fantastic. And I said, look, we can't pay attention to what they're going to say online because half the people, no matter what we do, are going to hate it. Half the people are probably going to like it. I said, we've got our marching orders. This is what we're going to do. And eventually, we got it all together. And then in issue 75 of Peter Parker Spider-Man, we brought the whole thing to a conclusion. And serendipitously, that happened to come out over Halloween. And that was the issue that we brought Norman back as the Goblin. And we killed off Ben Reilly. And I thought we killed off Ben Reilly permanently because we had him reduce to dust fragments and float away into the wind. But of course, they brought him back later. And there's a parenthetical thing to that as well. But we put it all together in 75 and we made it work. I'm very happy with the way it came out. I really am. And also, after the Clone Saga was over and we concluded it, there were other things that I felt needed to be done in Spider-Man. I felt that the villains had kind of been badly treated. They had aged the Vulture until he was, I think he had cancer or something like that. And they also had killed off Dr. Octopus. And they said, well, we've got a new Dr. Octopus now as a female character. And I said, I don't like the idea of killing off a lead Ditko villain. Certainly not one of the stature of Dr. Octopus. So when I took over Spider-Man, after we got all the Clone Saga stuff out of the way, I talked to my guys and I said, here's a few other things we want to do. I want to bring back Dr. Octopus, and that we did in Amazing Spider-Man, which Tom DeFalco was writing. I also want to bring back Aunt May. And I got Bob Harris on board with me on that one. Because I said, Aunt May is too important. Now, they did a brilliant issue 400.
Yep, I have it.
Right? It was a tearjerker. I cried like everybody else. But then I said, well, next, what do you do next? See, to me, the cast of Spider-Man, there are certain indispensable characters, and Aunt May is one of them. Because Aunt May is the embodiment of Peter Parker's guilt. When he sees her, he realizes that if not for his inaction, had he not gone after the burglar, she would not be a widow. No other character can replace that. That is his guilt manifest as a human being. Aunt May. And the relationship between them is so beautiful, so warm and loving. So we had to bring her back. So we did find a way to bring her back. And we also found a way to bring Dr. Octopus back. And of course, we brought Norman back. Now again, there was a lot of disharmony at the time from readers and things like that. Like, come on, you kill off a character and then you bring him back, and Norman Osborn, and I could do. And we even did a book called the Osborn Journal, as you remember, where we showed how Norman had actually survived that the goblin glider killing him because it really didn't kill him. He had the goblin formula, which was like a rejuvenating thing, and they replaced the body with a derelict, whatever. And what I found interesting is that later on, because I've used Marvel for so many years, is that when guys like Brian Bendis came in and Jeff Loeb and all that, they played with Norman Osborn. They made him the head of Hammer, and Norman Osborn became like a major player in the Marvel universe. And I said, if I hadn't brought him back, you guys wouldn't have Norman Osborn to play with. And the same thing with Aunt May. I think they got her married off or something and sent her to Florida, or maybe I guess she's back now. But again, too important a character. And the same thing with Dr. Octopus. We would never have had the Superior Spider-Man story had I not insisted that we bring back Dr. Octopus.
Now,
it's not Octavius.
Now, when we're talking about, you said no matter what, fans would get angry. What do you think they were more angry about, bringing back Norman Osborn or killing Ben Reilly? Like, where do you get more? Where do you see fans get more unhappy? Which one of those two?
I would say that the fandom was evenly divided because there were then fans of Ben Reilly, and the fact that we kind of had a reverse course and showed that it was really Peter Parker. But I thought we needed to give Ben Reilly a meaningful death. And him going in there to protect Peter and all, and dying a heroic death, I thought that worked for the character. But also, bringing back Norman Osborn, there was a lot of, negative feelings about that after all these years and all. So I said, we've got to find a way to make Norman's return convincing. And that's why we had to come up with this whole backstory, Scryer. We said Scryer were Norman's eyes in here, in this country, to follow Peter Parker, because he was in Europe during this whole time. That's why he was off the board. He was off the grid. But Scryer, who originally had been introduced as kind of a supernatural character, I didn't like that as part of Spider-Man. I didn't like Traveler as a supernatural thing. So we brought them back down to more size, and the Scryers became the group that Norman used to follow Peter Parker's movements, because Norman still despised Peter Parker. He was the one who had that hatred of Peter because Peter was the son he thought he should have had. Harry never lived up to his expectations, but Peter was the guy. And when he realized he was Spider-Man, kind of hated him even more. So I do think it worked out, and through the years, it was something that, again, people have played with these characters, and certainly having Otto Octavius back again, you have that fantastic storyline done where he becomes the superior Spider-Man, exchanges brains with Peter. So that worked out.
It's kind of funny. Looking back 30 years ago, okay, it's hard to imagine that there was even a debate on who was going to be the real Peter Parker, right? I mean,
Right.
The very concept that they were going to wipe away a couple of decades worth of story saying wasn't the real one all the time. I can't imagine that ever being functional going forward. I feel like at some point you would have to have said those stories were the legit Peter Parker.
Right.
Was there really that close of debate at the time when you had to make that decision to make him the real Peter Parker again? Or was it really that close of going, maybe it really is Ben Reilly? Because nowadays, looking back, you're like, they could never have done that. Like that could never have stood, considering what was going to happen.
You make a good point. I was not involved with Spider-Man books at that point. I can only tell you the way it worked out when Bob and I sat down to discuss it. But
Right.
what it was before that, I really don't know. Although the things that I'd heard was that they did intend that Ben Reilly would be established as the real Spider-Man, because the other character had gotten married, and this was a way of undoing the marriage and all the other things. So that was done. That was how they had that set up. But Bob wanted to go the other direction. I was fine with that. I mentioned something like a parenthetical thing before. Years later, and this is only going back now a few years, as you know, Ben Reilly is back. Now, Nick Lowe, who used to work with me and has become a fantastic editor in his own right, what he does in the Spider-Man books is just remarkable. He's done a brilliant job with the Spidey books. At the time, they were going to bring Ben Reilly back, and I thought we'd gotten rid of him for good. I said, okay, we've reduced him to dust floating like. Well, they did find a way, to bring him back. I guess somebody went up there and vacuumed up whatever dust particles was there. They were able to do something. Nick asked me to come on as a consulting editor. Like 25 years after we'd gotten rid of Ben Reilly, I was back working with Ben Reilly because this was when they were bringing him back and they were doing the whole thing with the Beyond Corporation and all that. And so Nick said, Ralph, why don't you come on and work as a consulting editor with my current crew because, you've got the whole background with Ben Reilly. So 25 years later, I found myself dealing with Ben Reilly again.
How good was that vacuum? Did you ever figure out what the name of the vacuum was that scooped him up after all these years? That's a great vacuum cleaner.
I don't know. I think you'd have to ask Dan Slott because I think it was Dan who brought him back, and Dan did a great job on Spider-Man. He did some fantastic stories, and again, Dan's the guy you got to credit for the Superior Spider-Man story. But at that time, they just wanted to bring him back, and now he's kind of reestablished in the Marvel universe.
Oh.
So. There we go.
I mean, I was just thinking, that'd be a hell of an ad for the vacuum cleaner company. Bringing back superheroes one vacuum at a time.
Acme Vacuum can bring back Ben Reilly.
That'd be awesome.
That was good, and I was flattered that Nick asked me to come on as a consulting editor behind the scenes and work with the writers, and talk about how we could bring him back and all that. So it was nice getting involved. As I mentioned at the beginning, I maintain a very strong relationship with Marvel. I frequently get asked to do the introductions to a lot of the books because I have that kind of background that I was there at the time. A lot of these things now are being reprinted, so I could give some personal insight into a lot of things. They just did, I think, a gigantic omnibus, a 2-issue omnibus of Mark Gruenwald's Captain America. And Brian Overton, who oversaw that, said that I was the only guy who knew Mark well enough and had edited him on Captain America to write the introduction for both those volumes. So I was very flattered that he asked. And I was also the guy though that took Mark off Captain America because at the time, Mark had stayed on Cap for about 10 years. And he was constantly coming up with new ideas. But I felt at the end, I think he had just about done enough. So I told him, I said, Mark, I think it's time for you to kind of move on. And I said, I can tell you this as a friend and as an editor, I think you're done. And, Mark accepted it. He understood. And that's when I hired Mark Waid and Ron Garney, and we had a whole new era with Captain America. So, and their work on that, was fabulous with the Operation Rebirth. But Mark did a fantastic job over 10 years. You can come on a book and stay 6 months, and you can do some great stuff. But to stay on a book for 10 years and constantly come up with new ideas and new concepts and things, that's the mark of a real talent. And I'm only sorry that my old friend Mark isn't with us today because he would have, when I go to conventions and I sign books that Mark and I worked on together, or I sign the Black Widow stories that George Perez and I did together, I feel so bad that those guys aren't there to co-sign with me because they were as much a part of those books as I was. And I just feel sorry that they were taken from us.
Well, I know we were talking a little bit about the new Eternals comic book that you're working on. When are we gonna see that?
Well, here's the thing. Mark Panicia contacted me. It was about a month or so ago, and he said, Ralph, we're doing a large 50th anniversary book of the Eternals. He goes to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And I said, that's great. He goes, I'd like you to write a story. So he gave me an allotted amount of pages. And because I love the Eternals, any Kirby thing I love. And so I sat down, and it was just one of those things that right after I got off the computer, not the phone, but the computer with Mark's request, I had an idea in my head to do the origin of the Reject, a character called Ransack, the Reject, who, as you remember, was the killing machine that in the gladiatorial pits of Lemuria, Athena came and took him and Carcass, who was the intellectual but looked like this gargoyle, and brought him to Olympia to try to sort of modify him a bit and make him fit in. And what I mentioned to Mark was, it always seemed to me that was very much like what Kirby did with Orion and Mr. Miracle, because if you remember the new guys, you remember that as part of the pact that Darkseid had with Highfather, Orion was taken from his place of birth, which was Apocalypse, and he was brought to New Genesis to become a warrior for New Genesis. And the Deviants in Lemuria are very similar to Apocalypse. They're the bad guys. And to have that character then taken to Olympia, which is very much like New Genesis, now you have to try to see if you can get this animal to fit in. So I've written a story that is the origin of the reject and how he actually is tried to fit in. But basically, the outline of the story is that no matter where he goes, he'll never fit in, because even though he has that beautiful face that made him an outcast among the deviants, because they're all hideous looking, but he had that angelic face, even though he's a monster. His real face is like Orion's, monstrous. So when he is in Olympia, if something goes wrong, his real face comes out. So he's a reject in both places. He'll never fit in anywhere. But the origin story just hit me right away. It's a character study, and I was very happy to have done it. Mike Cho just did the pencils. I barely even have a chance to look at them. I'm going to have my brother print them out this evening, and then I'm going to get back to Mike, and I'm going to certainly tell him the stuff looks fabulous. So,
well,
it's great working with you, as always.
So, when you're able to talk about it when it's out, please come back on the show. You've been absolutely awesome, Mr. Macchio. I've been an absolute pleasure to listen to you, sir. And like I said, I would love to have you back to talk about your new project.
Oh, pleasure, Jeff. Anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night, sir.
You too. Take care.